I was never his daughter. The moment I realized I didn't belong. Claire stood frozen at the reception desk, her fingers tightening around the cold plastic of the name tag. Claire Bennett, the family disappointment. The words, bold and unyielding, cut into her like a knife, sharper than any insult she had ever heard. She blinked, willing the letters to change, to morph into something else, something less humiliating. But no, the message remained, taunting her, declaring to the world what her family had always thought of her. From across the room, laughter rang out, a familiar, honeyed laugh that sent a chill down her spine. Victoria, the woman who had spent years turning her own home into a battlefield. Who had stripped Claire of every ounce of belonging she once had. Claire didn't need to look up to know that Victoria was watching her. Wine glass in hand, that smug smirk stretching across her lips. Claire's grip tightened around the name tag, her nails digging into her palm. What should she do? Throw it on the ground? Tear it apart? March over to Victoria and demand to know if she had orchestrated this humiliation? No. Claire had spent years learning how to play this game. Victoria wanted her to react. Wanted her to cause a scene so she could lean into Thomas's ear and sigh. See, she's always been difficult. Instead, Claire took a deep breath. Her expression carefully controlled. She placed the name tag back on the desk as if it meant nothing to her. As if she hadn't just been humiliated in front of an entire room of people. But inside, she knew, this wasn't just a name tag. It was the final confirmation that she had never truly belonged to this family. And she should have seen it coming. There was a time when Claire had been her father's entire world. When she was little, Thomas Bennett had been the kind of father who carried her on his shoulders. Who made her pancakes on Saturday mornings. Who told her bedtime stories until she drifted off to sleep. He used to call her his little princess. She had believed, with the unwavering trust of a child, that nothing could ever change that. She had been wrong. Everything shifted when Claire was 10 years old, the day Victoria entered their lives. Victoria was beautiful, elegant, and carried herself with the effortless grace of a woman who always got what she wanted. From the moment she stepped into their home, everything changed. Claire had wanted to like her. She had wanted a mother figure. Someone who would brush her hair and read her bedtime stories. Someone who would love her. But Victoria had no interest in playing mother. She had come into this marriage with 2 children of her own, Olivia and Brandon. And Claire? Claire had become an afterthought. At first, it was small things. Thomas, who had never missed a school event before, suddenly had urgent meetings whenever Claire had a recital. But he never missed Olivia's dance performances. He was too tired to take Claire to the park. But somehow, he always found time to take Brandon to baseball practice. Claire tried to tell herself it was a coincidence. That things would go back to how they used to be. But they never did. The first time Claire truly understood she had been replaced came on a rainy Friday afternoon when she was 11. She had stayed late after school, waiting on the front steps for her father to pick her up. The sky had turned dark, raindrops cold against her skin. She clutched her backpack, shifting from foot to foot as she watched the other kids get into warm cars, their parents greeting them with hugs. She waited, and waited, but Thomas never came. After an hour, Claire walked home alone, her clothes drenched, her shoes squelching with each step. She had told herself that the moment she got home, her father would be waiting, frantic with worry. Maybe he had been caught in traffic. Maybe his phone had died. But when she pushed open the front door, she wasn't met with concern. She was met with laughter. There he was, sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching a movie with Victoria, Olivia, and Brandon. They didn't even notice her standing there, dripping onto the floor. Her voice wavered as she finally spoke. "Dad, did you forget about me?" Thomas barely glanced up, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Claire, I was busy. You're old enough to understand, aren't you? Understand? Understand that she no longer mattered? That Olivia and Brandon were more important than her? That she had stood outside, waiting in the rain for a father who had forgotten she existed?" She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded, because she understood. From that moment on, Claire learned not to ask for anything. She became a shadow in her own home. Victoria never explicitly told Claire she wasn't welcome. She didn't need to. The message was clear in the little things. When Olivia spilled milk on the kitchen floor, Victoria would turn to Claire and say, "Clean it up, sweetheart." When Brandon forgot his homework, Victoria would sigh, "Claire, be a dear and take this to his school for me." And when Claire protested, the response was always the same. "You're older, Claire, you have to be responsible." It didn't matter that Olivia and Brandon never had to be responsible for anything. One night, Claire overheard her father and Victoria talking. She had just been walking past their bedroom when she heard her name. "She's a good girl," Thomas had said, "but she's not like Olivia." And that was when Claire truly understood. She would never be Olivia. She would never be enough. She would never be the perfect daughter that Victoria wanted. She would never be the child her father favored. She had lost him the moment he remarried. And there was nothing she could do to change it. By the time she was 16, Claire had stopped trying. She stopped asking for attention. Stopped seeking approval. She just existed. But one thing never changed. She never forgot. Every cold glance, every missed event, every moment she was made to feel like an outsider in her own family. She bottled it all up. Because she knew, one day, they would regret ever treating her this way. And that day was coming soon. The night Claire lost everything. Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she logged into her bank account. Her heart pounded, but she reassured herself. The money had to be there. It was supposed to be there. Her mother had saved it for her. She held her breath as the page loaded. Then, in a matter of seconds, her world shattered. Balance, $0. Claire's stomach twisted into knots. She refreshed the page once, twice, but the number didn't change. Her hands felt cold, her fingers numb as she sat there, staring at the empty account. The money was gone. The money her mother had worked so hard to set aside for her. The money that was supposed to pay for her future. Gone. Claire's mind raced, panic clawing at her throat. This had to be a mistake. A glitch in the system. There was no way the money could just vanish. But deep down, she knew exactly what had happened. Her father had taken it. Her blood ran cold as she pushed away from the desk and stormed downstairs. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of the television playing in the background. Thomas sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't just stolen her entire future from her. Claire's voice trembled as she spoke. "Where is it?" Thomas barely glanced up. "Where's what?" "The money, Dad. My college fund. The one Mom left for me." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his face. Annoyance? Guilt? No, it wasn't guilt. It was indifference. "Oh," he said, as if she had asked about the weather. "I used it." The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken. But she forced herself to stand tall. "You used it?" "Brandon needed it," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "His tuition isn't cheap." The world tilted around her. Brandon. He had used her mother's money to fund Brandon's education. Not hers. Claire's breathing grew ragged. She wanted to believe this was some kind of cruel misunderstanding. That her father, her own father, would never do this to her. But the way he spoke, the way he barely even looked at her, made it clear. This wasn't a mistake. He had never intended to let her have that money. She swallowed the lump in her throat. That money wasn't yours to take. Thomas sighed, finally setting his drink down. "Claire, don't be dramatic. You're smart. You'll figure something out. Apply for scholarships. Take out a loan if you have to. You'll be fine." "Fine. Fine." Claire's hands shook as she clenched them into fists. She had spent years feeling like an outsider in this house. But at least she had always believed she had one thing, her future. Now, even that had been stolen from her. She let out a hollow laugh. But there was no humor in it. "You stole from me." Thomas finally looked up then, frowning as if she were the one being unreasonable. "Watch your tone. Claire, I did what was best for the family." Family. That word made her stomach turn. She wasn't part of this family. Not really. If she were, he would have never done this to her. She had nothing left here. Nothing. Claire exhaled sharply and turned on her heel. Stomping upstairs, she grabbed a suitcase from her closet and started stuffing clothes inside. She heard footsteps behind her. "Victoria, what are you doing?" her stepmother asked, voice laced with false concern. Claire didn't even bother looking at her. "Leaving." Victoria let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, Claire, don't be so childish. You're overreacting." Claire snapped the suitcase shut, rage burning in her chest. "Overreacting? He stole my future. He used my mother's money to send your son to college instead of me." Victoria didn't even flinch. She just gave Claire a small, patronizing smile. "Well, Brandon has a real future ahead of him." The implication was clear. Brandon was worth investing in. Claire wasn't. Claire sucked in a shaky breath, fighting the urge to scream. They had never seen her as an equal. They had never cared about her. This wasn't a home. It was just a place where she had been forced to exist. Victoria leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Where will you even go?" she mused. "You have no money, no plan. Maybe you should be a little more grateful that your father still lets you stay here." Grateful? Claire almost laughed again. She didn't need to stay here. She didn't need their stolen money. She would figure it out on her own. Claire yanked her suitcase off the bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She walked past Victoria without another word, without looking back, down the stairs, through the front door, out of the house that had never truly been hers. And no one stopped her. No one called her back. No one asked where she was going. Because they didn't care. And that was the moment Claire knew she had never really belonged here. She was on her own now. And she would make sure they lived to regret ever casting her aside. Surviving on her own. Claire's journey to independence. The first night away from home, Claire sat in the tiny motel room, staring at the flickering ceiling light. The air smelled of cheap detergent, and the bed was stiff, nothing like the soft one she had left behind. But she didn't care. She was free. She had no money, no home, no one to turn to. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel suffocated. The weight of her father's disappointment, of Victoria's fake smiles, of being the forgotten child, it was all gone. But so was her safety net. The next morning, Claire woke up to the harsh reality of her situation. She had $38 to her name, a single suitcase, and no clear plan. College had been her future. But now, without the money her mother had left her, it was slipping further away. Still, she refused to go back. She refused to let them win. Claire spent her first few days bouncing between coffee shops, libraries, and internet cafes, applying for every possible job she could find. She didn't care what it was: waiting tables, retail, cleaning offices at night, anything that could keep her afloat. Days passed, then weeks. She was rejected more times than she could count. Most employers wanted experience, which she didn't have. Some gave her pitying looks when she asked about full-time positions. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, she landed her first job, a late-night shift at a 24-hour diner. The pay was terrible, and the hours were brutal, but it was enough to keep her from starving. The first time she received a paycheck, Claire stared at the numbers printed on the paper. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover her rent at a tiny, run-down apartment she had found, but it was hers. No one had handed it to her. No one had stolen it from her. She had earned it. That night, she bought herself a small cupcake from a grocery store and lit a candle on top, whispering to herself, "Happy first step, balancing work and education." But Claire knew that just surviving wasn't enough. She still wanted more for herself. So after months of saving, she applied for a local community college. Without her mother's money, she couldn't afford a prestigious university like she had dreamed of. But she didn't let that stop her. During the day, she attended classes, determined to prove she didn't need her father's stolen money to succeed. At night, she worked double shifts at the diner, scrubbing down greasy tables, pouring coffee for exhausted truck drivers, and trying to ignore the pain in her feet after 10 hours of standing. She barely slept. Some nights, she collapsed onto her tiny mattress, still in her uniform, too exhausted to even take her shoes off. But she kept going. She had to. Her father had told her she could figure something out, that she could apply for scholarships. So she did. She spent hours writing essays, sending out applications, fighting for every dollar she could get. And slowly, it paid off. By her second year, she had secured enough scholarships and grants to cover most of her tuition. By her third year, she was working as a research assistant, gaining real experience, making connections. She didn't have weekends off like other students. She didn't have the luxury of traveling or partying. But she had something better. She had a future she built with her own hands. The graduation no one came to. 4 years passed. Claire stood in line, wearing the cap and gown she had bought with her own money. Her fingers tightened around the diploma in her hands. Her name had just been called. People were clapping, but not for her. There were no cheers from family. No camera flashes capturing the moment. No one had come. She had known they wouldn't. She had known her father wouldn't waste his time attending. Victoria wouldn't bother. Olivia and Brandon probably didn't even remember today was her graduation. But as she stood there, alone among the crowd of proud parents and joyful students, she didn't feel sad. She felt powerful, because she had made it. Without them, without their help, without their stolen money, she had built this future with her own strength. And no one could take it away from her. Starting from nothing, building an empire. Claire wasn't done. She had spent years being underestimated, being told she wasn't good enough, being ignored. But now, she had a degree in business administration and finance. And she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She started working at a small startup, handling finances and strategy. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was still low. But she absorbed every bit of knowledge like a sponge. She watched how businesses operated. She learned what worked and what didn't. And then, she took a risk. With every dollar she had saved, she launched her own consulting firm. At first, it was just her and a laptop, working out of her tiny apartment. But she was relentless. She built her network, took on small clients, worked day and night. And then, one client became 2, 2 became 5. And 5 became 100. By the time she turned 27, her company was worth millions. She was no longer the forgotten girl who had been left in the rain. She was no longer the disappointment. She was Claire Bennett, CEO of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm. And the best part? Her family had no idea. The party that changed everything. Claire had spent years building a life far away from the people who had once cast her aside. She had fought tooth and nail to make something of herself. Without a single helping hand from the family that abandoned her. She had her own company now. A thriving business that was making waves in the corporate world. And they had no idea. So when the invitation arrived, a beautifully embossed card announcing Thomas Bennett's grand birthday celebration, she almost threw it away. Almost. She stared at the gold lettering. At the carefully crafted words that made it seem like a warm family gathering. It was a lie. Thomas hadn't invited her because he wanted her there. He had invited her to keep up appearances. To prove to his wealthy friends that he was a good father. That thought alone made Claire's blood boil. For a long time, she had ignored every attempt at contact. Every fake gesture of reconciliation. But this time, something inside her shifted. She would go. Not as the girl they once belittled. Not as the forgotten daughter who had been cast aside. But as Claire Bennett, the woman they could no longer control. The name tag that broke everything. The moment she stepped into the grand ballroom, she knew she had made the right decision. The chandeliers sparkled like diamonds. The tables were adorned with the finest floral arrangements. And the guests, all high-profile businessmen, politicians, and socialites, clinked their glasses in a well-orchestrated performance of wealth and success. It was all so calculated. Nothing about this event was genuine, least of all her invitation. As she made her way toward the reception desk, a sharp laugh rang out from the bar. Claire didn't even have to turn her head to know who it was. Victoria. The woman had spent years making sure Claire knew her place, at the bottom. The moment she walked in, Victoria's eyes were already on her. Filled with that same condescending amusement she had always worn. Claire ignored her. Instead, she turned her attention to the table where name tags were neatly arranged. Her breath hitched. There, among the polished gold-lettered cards, was hers. Claire Bennett, the family disappointment. For a moment, the room blurred. The air turned cold. She blinked, hoping she had read it wrong. But no, The words remained. Staring back at her, she could hear Victoria's laughter in the distance. Feel the way eyes flickered toward her, waiting to see how she would react. Her fingers curled around the name tag, the sharp edges pressing into her skin. What should she do? Throw it? Tear it apart? Walk out? No. That's what they expected. That's what they wanted. Instead, she did something else. Something far more powerful. She placed the name tag back on the table, as if it meant nothing. Because it didn't. Not anymore. Claire took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and walked deeper into the party. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to end this charade once and for all. The toast that no one expected. The party continued around her, but Claire felt like an outsider looking in. Thomas was at the center of it all, surrounded by his closest business partners, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. Olivia and Brandon stood proudly beside him, basking in the attention as if they were royalty. No one noticed Claire. They never had. She stood at the edge of the room, watching the way her father smiled so effortlessly, as if he were truly proud of the life he had built. A life that had no place for her. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and she grabbed a glass, her fingers steady despite the fire burning inside her. Then, she did something bold. She stepped forward, into the center of the room. The movement was small, but it shifted the energy instantly. People turned. Conversations died down. Even Thomas's laughter faded as his gaze landed on her. She raised her glass. A toast, she said, her voice calm, unwavering. The silence deepened. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, others lifted their glasses, waiting for her to speak. Claire let the moment stretch. Let them feel the weight of her presence. Then she smiled, cold, calculated, the same way they had always smiled at her. To family, she said, her voice dripping with something unreadable. She saw the flicker of unease in her father's expression. The way Olivia's fingers tightened around her glass. The way Victoria's smirk faltered. To the kind of family that teaches you exactly what you don't want to become. A hush fell over the room. Claire tilted her head, pretending to think. Oh, and of course, to the people who remind us that sometimes walking away is the best decision you'll ever make. Glass clinked softly in the silence. No one dared to speak. Claire met Thomas's eyes, and for the first time in years, she saw something she had never seen before. Regret. Good. She took a sip of her champagne, savoring the moment, then set the glass down with a quiet clink. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to look back, because she already knew. She was never coming back. The last words she ever said to her father. Claire could feel their eyes on her as she turned to leave. The weight of the silence. The tension thick enough to suffocate the entire room. She had done what she came to do. She had delivered her final words. A toast laced with the truth they had spent years trying to ignore. She had watched their smiles fade, their laughter die in their throats. For once, she was the one holding the power. But just as she reached the grand doors of the ballroom, she heard his voice. Claire. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't filled with anger. It was hesitant. For the first time in years, Thomas Bennetts sounded unsure. Claire didn't stop. She didn't turn back. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. Claire, wait. The words sent a bitter chill down her spine. Wait? How many times had she waited for him? Waited outside her school in the rain when he forgot to pick her up. Waited at the dinner table while he showered Olivia and Brandon with praise. Waited for an apology that never came. Waited for him to tell her she mattered. Waited for him to love her the way he once had. Now, finally, he was the one waiting for her. And she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Claire stopped, but she didn't turn around. What do you want, Dad? Her voice was steady, colder than she expected. She could hear him stepping closer. The murmurs of the guests had faded into the background. It was just them now. Father and daughter. A conversation that should have happened years ago. Claire, he hesitated. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to embarrass me in front of everyone. A laugh, soft, hollow, escaped her lips. That's what he cared about. His image, his reputation, not what he had done to her. not what he had taken from her. She finally turned, tilting her head as she studied him. "Embarrass you?" she repeated. "Is that what you think I did?" Thomas sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as if she were exhausting him. "Claire, you've always been so dramatic. I was just trying to do what was best for the family." Family. That word again. That word that he loved to throw around like it meant something. Claire took a slow step toward him, her gaze never wavering. "I was your family," she said, her voice sharp, unforgiving, "but you threw me away the moment you found a new one." She saw it then, the flicker of something in his expression. Not guilt, not remorse, just realization. Because for the first time, he understood that she wasn't that little girl anymore. She wasn't waiting for his approval. She wasn't begging for his love. She was done. "I don't need you anymore," Claire continued, each word slow and deliberate. "And that scares you, doesn't it?" His jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "That's not true. I've always cared about you." She scoffed. "No, Dad, you cared about what I could do for you. You cared about having a daughter who wouldn't make you look bad. You cared about control, and the second I stopped being easy to control, you replaced me." She let the words sink in. "Well, congratulations." She spread her arms mockingly. "You got exactly what you wanted. Olivia and Brandon, your perfect kids, your perfect life. So why does it bother you so much that I don't need any of it?" His silence was answer enough. Because deep down, he knew she was right. For years, Claire had been nothing more than a stain on his picture-perfect world. A disappointment he had conveniently ignored. And now, she had built something greater than he ever could have imagined. And he had no part in it. "I'm done, Dad," she said, finality dripping from every syllable. This is the last conversation we will ever have." Thomas's eyes darkened. "Claire, don't be ridiculous." "Oh, I'm not." She took a step back. "You made your choice a long time ago. And now, I'm making mine." She turned on her heel, heading toward the door, ready to close this chapter forever. His voice stopped her one last time. "Claire." She paused. A beat of silence. "If you walk away now." His voice was low, edged with something almost desperate. "You don't get to come back." Claire smiled. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. She glanced over her shoulder, meeting his gaze one final time. "I was never planning to." And with that, she walked away. Forever. The ultimate revenge. Taking back what was hers. Claire didn't just walk away from her father's birthday party. She walked away from the family that had never truly been hers. But this time, she wasn't leaving empty-handed. She had spent years enduring their rejection, suffering through their cruelty, and fighting to build a life on her own. They had taken everything from her, her mother's money, her sense of belonging, her childhood dreams. But now, she was ready to take it all back. And she had planned every single step. The investigation that changed everything. Long before she set foot in that ballroom, Claire had been preparing for this moment. She had hired a team of private investigators and a powerful legal team, digging through years of financial records. Her target? The money her mother had left for her. The inheritance that Thomas had stolen. And she had found exactly what she was looking for. A paper trail, bank transfers, documents that showed her father had not only taken the entirety of her college fund but had also illegally rerouted assets meant for her into business ventures benefiting Olivia and Brandon. It was fraud, it was theft, and it was enough to ruin him. So, as Claire sat in the backseat of a car that night, watching the lights of the city blur past, she made the call. Proceed. That was all she needed to say. And just like that, Thomas Bennett's world began to crumble. The fall of Thomas Bennett. The lawsuit hit the Bennett family like a bomb. Thomas had spent decades cultivating his reputation as a respected businessman, an untouchable figure in his industry. But suddenly, his financial records were being scrutinized by auditors and legal authorities. It didn't take long before the truth unraveled. The funds that were supposed to be Claire's had been illegally siphoned into personal accounts and investments under Victoria's name. Claire watched from a distance as his business empire began to collapse. First, the shareholders panicked. Then, his company's stock plummeted. Investors pulled out, legal fees piled up, and the media caught wind of the scandal. Within weeks, his company was in shambles. And the once mighty Thomas Bennett was now fighting to keep himself from financial ruin. Brandon and Olivia's downfall. Brandon was expelled from college. Without the illegal funds that had been paying for his tuition, the university was forced to revoke his enrollment due to unpaid balances. His luxurious lifestyle, the sports cars, the extravagant vacations, disappeared overnight. And Olivia? The wedding she had planned, the designer dress, the 5-star venue? Cancelled. Without Thomas's money to fund her perfect life, she was forced to downsize everything. Her fiancé's family, once eager to merge into the prestigious Bennett name, suddenly lost interest. It wasn't long before he called off the engagement. Claire didn't need to lift a finger to destroy them. They had done it to themselves. Victoria's desperate plea. It was late one evening when Claire's phone rang. She stared at the screen, unimpressed. Victoria. She let it ring, then rang again. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. She answered, placing the phone on speaker. Claire. Victoria's voice was sharp, yet strained. You've made your point. Claire raised an eyebrow. Have I? You don't understand what you're doing. Victoria snapped. This family is falling apart. Claire leaned back in her chair, enjoying the irony. You mean your family, not mine. Silence. Then, a sigh of defeat. Fine, what do you want? Victoria finally asked. And there it was. The desperation. The moment Claire had been waiting for. I don't want anything, she said, voice cool, but I hope you enjoy your new reality. You spent years treating me like I was disposable. Now, you know what that feels like. And with that, she hung up. She had nothing left to say to them. One last meeting with Thomas. Claire hadn't planned on seeing her father again. But when she received a message from his lawyer requesting a meeting, she agreed, not because she wanted to reconcile, but because she wanted to see the man who had once stood so tall, now brought to his knees. The meeting took place in a small law office, a far cry from the lavish corporate buildings Thomas once ruled. When she stepped inside, he was already there, sitting at the desk, but he wasn't the same man she had grown up fearing. His suit was slightly wrinkled. His eyes were tired, the weight of his downfall visible in the slump of his shoulders. For the first time, Thomas Bennett looked small. He cleared his throat. Claire. She didn't respond. She simply took a seat, crossing her arms, waiting. He exhaled heavily. I suppose you're happy. A slow smile touched her lips. For the first time in a long time? Yes. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean for it to end this way. You never meant for me to succeed either. Claire pointed out. But here we are. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke. What do you want, Claire? Claire studied him, seeing the man who had once been everything to her. The man who had let her stand in the rain. Forgotten. Who had stolen from her. Who had let Victoria humiliate her. She had waited years for this moment. And now? She realized she didn't want anything from him. She had already won. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so that he felt every single word. I want you to remember that you had a daughter. She stood up, grabbing her bag, and that she never needed you. She walked out without looking back. This time, he didn't call after her. Claire's victory. The revenge wasn't just in watching them fall. It was in knowing she had already won long before their downfall began. She had built something without them. She had survived, thrived, and succeeded. And now? Now, she was free. Truly free. No more looking back. No more waiting for them to change. Because she had already left them behind. Forever. Lessons from Claire's story. Claire's journey is more than just a story of revenge. It's a testament to resilience, self-worth, and the power of walking away from toxic relationships. One of the biggest lessons here is that family is not defined by blood, but by respect and support. Claire spent years waiting for validation from people who never truly valued her. But the moment she stopped seeking their approval, she found something far more valuable, her own strength. Another powerful takeaway is that success is the best revenge. Instead of letting her father's betrayal define her, Claire used it as fuel to build something greater. She didn't let their cruelty break her. She let it push her forward. Lastly, Claire's story reminds us that justice isn't always about getting even. It's about reclaiming what was taken from you. She didn't destroy her father's life out of spite. She took back what was rightfully hers. What do you think? Did Claire make the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of revenge, resilience, and karma, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. More powerful stories are coming soon. Rocket Fire.